The brown envelope on Valencia Ramirez's desk seemed to weigh a ton. Inside, a contract that would change her life, and not necessarily in the way she had dreamed of as a child, playing weddings with her dolls in her small Bronx apartment. $5 million, Valencia whispered to herself, her fingers drumming nervously on the surface of the table in her small office at the Hope and Health Community Clinic. The amount was surreal, especially for someone who grew up counting coins to help her grandmother pay the bills. The proposal had come through Gregory Matthews, corporate lawyer for Sterling Enterprises, 3 days after Valencia had performed an emergency physical therapy session with Donovan Sterling. The billionaire had suffered a particularly severe spasm during a board meeting, and Valencia was the only physical therapist available at that time at Manhattan Presbyterian Hospital. The gentle touch of his experienced fingers and his professional approach had impressed Donovan, even though he had barely uttered 3 words during the entire session. Now here was the proposal, a marriage of convenience lasting 2 years, with Valencia acting not only as a cover wife, but also as a private physiotherapist. The community clinic where he worked was sinking into debt. 3 months of late rent, equipment in need of maintenance, and a growing list of patients who couldn't afford treatment. $5 million would not only solve the clinic's financial problems, but would allow it to expand, making it possible to serve more people in the community who needed it so much. Valencia got up and walked to the window of his office, watching the children playing in the small park across the street. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind. "Sometimes, mi amor, we have to make sacrifices for others." The intercom rang, interrupting his thoughts. "Miss Ramirez, Mr. Sterling has arrived for the meeting," his assistant, Maria, announced. Valencia took a deep breath, adjusted her white coat, and put the envelope in the drawer. When he opened the door to his office, he found Donovan Sterling in his imposing motorized wheelchair, wearing an impeccable Italian suit that probably cost more than his annual salary. "Mr. Sterling," she greeted, maintaining a professional tone. "Miss Ramirez," he replied, his voice deep and controlled. His blue-gray eyes studied her with intensity. "I assume you've read my proposal." Valencia indicated the treatment area of his office, where a special stretcher was set up. "Can we talk while I do your assessment?" Donovan nodded, and his personal assistant, Marcus, helped him transfer to the gurney. Valencia noticed how Donovan's jaw muscles tightened during the transfer. He hated relying on help. "Why me?" Valencia asked as he began to examine his paralyzed legs. "There are hundreds of more experienced physical therapists in New York." "You have something they don't," Donovan replied, watching their methodical movements. "Authenticity. I didn't see pity in your eyes that day at the hospital, just professional determination." Valencia worked in silence for a few moments, assessing the extent of the spinal cord injury. "That's not enough for a marriage, even if it's just on paper." "My investors are nervous," Donovan explained, his voice betraying a slight hint of bitterness. "After the accident, the shares fell 30%. They need to see stability, a story of overcoming. A dedicated wife and competent physiotherapist sends exactly that message." "And you don't care that I'm a Latina from the Bronx with no social pedigree?" An ironic smile appeared on Donovan's lips. "This only makes the story more interesting for the media. The wheelchair-bound billionaire finds true love with the dedicated physical therapist who helps with his recovery." Valencia noticed increased spasticity in his right leg and applied a myofascial release technique. Donovan visibly relaxed under her touch. "What if I say no?" "Then I will find another solution," he replied simply. "But your clinic will continue to sink, and those children I saw in the hallway will lose access to quality care." Valencia stopped his movements, staring at him. "You investigated the clinic." "I investigate everything that interests me, Miss Ramirez." Silence filled the room as Valencia finished the assessment. His mind worked furiously, weighing every aspect of the proposal. 2 years of your life in exchange for the clinic's survival. 2 years of pretending to be the wife of a man who viewed marriage as a business transaction. "I have some conditions," she finally said, helping him back to his wheelchair. "I'm listening." "First, I keep my job at the clinic 2 days a week. Second, I want access to the best experimental treatments available for spinal cord injury. And third, no forced physical intimacy on camera. Donovan watched her with new interest. Have you researched experimental treatments? Since I saw him at the hospital, Valencia confirmed. There are promising studies on neural regeneration at Stanford. For the first time, Valencia saw something different in Donovan's eyes, a quickly suppressed spark of hope. Your conditions are acceptable, he said, pulling out his phone. Gregory will prepare the updated contract later today. The wedding needs to take place in 2 weeks, before the annual shareholder meeting. Valencia nodded, feeling the weight of his decision. 2 weeks, then. When Donovan left the office, Valencia returned to the window. The children were still playing in the park, oblivious to the agreement that had just been reached. A deal that would save her clinic, but would tie her to a man as wounded on the inside as he was on the outside. Over the next 2 weeks, Valencia Ramirez would become Mrs. Sterling, and her life would completely change. What she didn't yet know was that her mission to heal Donovan would go far beyond his spinal cord injury. She would need to find a way through the invisible scars that kept him as paralyzed as his physical condition. The luxurious halls of Sterling Enterprises on Manhattan's 45th floor reflected the empire Donovan built, but to Valencia, sitting at the mahogany desk in his office, the place seemed like a gilded cage. 2 weeks had passed in a blur of meetings with lawyers, dress fittings, and carefully orchestrated photo shoots for the press. The documents are all in order. Gregory Matthews slid a leather folder across the table. The civil wedding will be tomorrow at 10 a.m., followed by a small press reception at 2 p.m. Valencia signed each page with surgical precision, the same care he applied when treating his patients. Each signature was a step deeper into his new reality. "Where's Donovan?" she asked, noticing his absence from the final meeting. "Physical therapy session with Dr. Harrison," Gregory replied, organizing his papers. He insisted on maintaining his normal routine. Valencia frowned. Richard Harrison was known for his old-fashioned and conservative methods. Is he still using that treatment protocol from the 90s? Donovan is particular about his medical choices. Gregory chose his words carefully. Well, that's going to change, Valencia declared, standing up. Starting tomorrow, I'm officially your personal physical therapist. In the hallway, he found Marcus, Donovan's personal assistant, carrying a stack of documents. He's in the building's medical center, Marcus offered, without her needing to ask. Valencia took the elevator to the 3rd floor, where a private medical wing served exclusively the company's executives. Through the frosted glass door, he could hear Dr. Harrison's authoritative voice. "Mr. Sterling, we need to be realistic about your limitations." Valencia opened the door without ceremony. Donovan lay on the gurney, his face a mask of suppressed frustration, while Harrison performed a series of passive exercises on his legs. "Dr. Ramirez," Harrison greeted coldly, "this is a private session." "In fact," Valencia advanced, "as Mr. Sterling's future wife and designated physical therapist, I have every right to be here." Donovan's eyes met hers, a mixture of surprise and something that might have been admiration. "I see you're using 90s techniques," she continued, approaching the gurney. "Have you considered incorporating functional electrical stimulation combined with biofeedback?" "Miss Ramirez," Harrison straightened, "I have 30 years of experience. And I have the latest research from Stanford, Hopkins, and Mayo Clinic," Valencia interrupted, taking her tablet from her bag and showing a series of studies. "In addition to contacts with researchers developing promising experimental treatments." Donovan watched the fight in silence, but Valencia noticed how his fingers drummed on the stretcher, a sign of interest that she had already noticed during their sessions. "Mr. Sterling," Harrison turned to his patient, "I suggest caution with unproven treatments." "Show me," Donovan spoke for the first time, addressing Valencia. She approached, naturally assuming the position next to the stretcher. "Can I?" you asked, your hands hovering over his legs. With a nod of agreement from Donovan, Valencia began demonstrating a neural mobilization technique combined with specific pressure points. Within seconds, the tense muscles in his thighs began to relax. "What are you doing?" Donovan asked, surprise evident in his voice. "Accessing the neural pathways that are still intact," Valencia explained, his fingers working with precision. "Your injury is incomplete, which means there is potential for recovery that is not being explored." Harrison cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable. "Mr. Sterling, if I may." "You can leave, Doctor," Donovan said without taking his eyes off Valencia's hands. "From now on, Dr. Ramirez will take over my treatment." After Harrison left, a comfortable silence filled the room as Valencia continued the treatment. It was the first time they were truly alone since the agreement. "Why didn't you ever look into other treatment options?" she asked softly. Donovan was slow to respond. "After the accident, I saw 7 different specialists, each with a new promise, each with a new failure. And you gave up." "I adapted," he corrected. "I built a life that works within my limitations." Valencia stopped the treatment, meeting his gaze. "What if you didn't just have to adapt? What if there was a real chance for improvement? Do you really believe this? Or is it just part of the show we're going to put on for the shareholders?" The question took her by surprise, but Valencia didn't hesitate. "I would never play with hope, Donovan, especially not yours." Something changed in his expression, as if an invisible wall had begun to crack. "The wedding is tomorrow," he said after a moment. "Yes," Valencia replied, going back to working on her legs. "And after that, we'll begin a new treatment protocol, unless you'd rather stick to Dr. Harrison's 90s techniques." A small smile tugged at the corner of Donovan's mouth. "You're always so stubborn, persistent, determined," he added. Valencia smiled, continuing the treatment in silence. Tomorrow she would become Mrs. Sterling, but at that moment, in that room, she was just a physical therapist, determined to help her patient rediscover possibilities he had dismissed. What neither realized was that as Valencia worked to awaken the dormant nerves in Donovan's legs, something was also beginning to awaken in their hearts, something no contract could predict or control. The wedding day dawned with a grey covering typical of Manhattan, but inside City Hall, Valencia's nervousness had nothing to do with the weather. Wearing an elegant, simple-cut white dress, she watched her reflection in the women's bathroom mirror, trying to recognize the woman staring back at her. "You look beautiful, mi amor." The voice of his grandmother, Carmen, brought tears to his eyes. The 70-year-old woman was the only person who knew the truth about the arrangement, besides the lawyers. "Abuela, what if I'm making a mistake?" Valencia whispered, adjusting the pearl necklace her grandmother had worn to her own wedding. "Mija, you've always known what was right, ever since you were little. If your heart says this will save the clinic, then it's not a mistake." A soft knock on the door interrupted the moment. "Miss Ramirez?" "It's time," Donovan's assistant Marcus announced. Valencia took a deep breath, checked her makeup one last time, and headed to the ceremony room. Upon entering, her eyes immediately found Donovan. He looked impeccable in his navy blue suit, his custom wheelchair shining under the fluorescent lights. But it was his expression that caught her by surprise. There was a vulnerability in his eyes that she had never seen before. The ceremony was brief and formal, exactly as planned. When the judge pronounced the final words, Valencia felt Donovan's fingers lightly squeeze hers. It was the first time he had initiated physical contact that was not related to physical therapy. "Ladies and gentlemen," the official photographer positioned himself, "shall we take some photos for the press?" Valencia instinctively moved behind Donovan's chair, but he surprised her again. "By my side," he murmured, just for her to hear. "We're partners now, not my caretaker." The gesture did not go unnoticed by those present, and Valencia saw Gregory Matthews, the lawyer, nod approvingly. It was exactly the kind of moment that would sell their story to the public. After the photos, as they prepared for the reception at the Sterling Tower, Valencia enjoyed some alone time with Donovan in their private penthouse. "I need to change your dressing before the reception," she said, grabbing her medical bag. "You don't have to do that today," Donovan replied, but Valencia was already positioned next to him. "I'm your wife and physical therapist, remember?" She smiled, starting to unbutton his shirt with professional care. "Besides, we need to talk about your new treatment program." Donovan watched as she changed the dressing on the bed sore that had formed on his back, a common complication in wheelchair-bound patients. "Do you really believe there can be progress?" "I guess we'll never know if we don't try," Valencia replied, applying the new bandage. "I've already scheduled an appointment with Dr. Lauren Chen at Stanford for next week. She's leading revolutionary research in neural regeneration." "California?" Donovan frowned. "I have important meetings." "Which can be done via video conference," Valencia interrupted him. "Your recovery is a priority now." A tense silence filled the room until Donovan finally spoke. "Have you always been this bossy with your other patients?" "Only with the stubborn ones," she replied with a smile, finishing the bandage. "And you, Mr. Sterling, are at the top of that list." When their eyes met, something changed in the air between them. For a moment, they were no longer physiotherapist and patient, not even a fake couple. They were just two people beginning to see beyond the surfaces they had constructed. The moment was interrupted by a knock on the door. "Mr. Sterling, guests are arriving," Marcus announced. The reception was held in the hanging garden of the Sterling Tower, overlooking Central Park. Valencia watched, fascinated, as Donovan transformed when interacting with executives and journalists. Her calculated smile, her precise responses. It was a dance he knew well. "And how did you fall in love?" asked a Wall Street Journal reporter, her recorder pointed at the couple. Valencia felt Donovan's hand reach for hers, a rehearsed gesture that still made her heart skip a beat. "It was during a physical therapy session," he replied, his voice soft. "Valencia didn't treat me like a broken man, but like someone who still had the potential for more." The answer caught her off guard. It wasn't what they had rehearsed, and the emotion in her voice seemed too genuine to be just acting. "And for you, Mrs. Sterling?" Valencia looked at Donovan, remembering how her eyes had lit up when she mentioned the new treatments. "That's when I realized that behind all that strength, there was a man who hadn't given up on dreaming yet," she replied, surprising herself with the truth in her words. Later, when the last guests had left, Valencia found Donovan in his penthouse library, staring out the picture window at the city. "You were brilliant today," he said without turning around. "You weren't bad either," she replied, moving closer. "That story about how we fell in love—" "Sometimes the best lie is the one with a grain of truth in it," Donovan interrupted, finally turning to face her. "You don't really see me as broken, do you?" Valencia knelt beside his chair, her eyes level with his. "No. I see a man who needs to remember that limitations do not define who we are." The town clock struck midnight, marking the end of their first day as husband and wife. In the silent library, with the lights of Manhattan twinkling in the background, Valencia and Donovan shared a moment of mutual understanding that no contract could predict or explain. The first week of marriage brought a routine that neither of them had anticipated. Valencia split her time between the community clinic and the penthouse apartment she now shared with Donovan as they prepared for the trip to Stanford. On the morning of the flight, Valencia found Donovan in his private office, conducting a video conference with international shareholders. She paused in the doorway, watching as he commanded the meeting with natural authority, his wheelchair strategically positioned so that only his torso and face appeared on the screen. "Third-quarter numbers exceed projections by 15%, Donovan explained, his eyes fixed on the screen, "and with the new partnership in Asia." He stopped when he noticed Valencia, a small smile appearing on his lips before he could stop it. "Gentlemen, we will continue this discussion next week," he concluded the meeting efficiently. When the screens went dark, he turned to Valencia. "Is it time yet?" "The plane is ready," she confirmed, approaching his desk. "But first, we need to do your morning exercises." Donovan consulted his Rolex. "We only have 2 hours until the flight." "And we only need 45 minutes, Valencia replied, already moving some chairs to create space. "Also, exercise before a long flight helps prevent thrombosis." As he helped Donovan transfer to the exercise mat he always carried with him, Valencia noticed the tension in his shoulders. "You're nervous about the appointment." "I'm not nervous," he protested, but his muscles betrayed him under her experienced hands. "Donovan Sterling, for someone who built an empire on trading, you're a terrible liar," she teased, beginning a series of stretches. "Maybe I'm apprehensive," he admitted after a moment. "Dr. Chen has an impressive reputation." "And that's why we're going to her," Valencia replied, methodically working on her legs. "But there's something else bothering you." Donovan was silent for so long that Valencia didn't think he would respond. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than usual. "What if it goes wrong? If it creates false hope?" Valencia stopped the exercises, sitting across from him. "Look, I can't promise it'll work. But I can promise I'll be by your side every step of the way, whatever the outcome." Their eyes met, and for a moment, the masks they both wore, he as the ruthless businessman, she as the distant professional, fell. "Why do you care so much?" Donovan asked softly. "Because it's who I am," she replied simply. "I can't see someone needing help and not do everything I can, even if it's an arranged deal. Especially in this case," Valencia smiled, returning to her exercises. "After all, what kind of wife would I be if I didn't help my husband?" The comment elicited a rare, genuine smile from Donovan, lighting up his features in a way that made Valencia's heart skip a beat. 3 hours later, they were on a Sterling Enterprises private jet, flying across the country toward California. Valencia watched Donovan work on his laptop, answering emails incessantly. "You need to rest," she said, gently closing the computer screen. "It's a 5-hour flight." "I have a company to run," he protested, but allowed her to keep the laptop. "And I have a patient to take care of," Valencia replied, reclining his chair. "Also, I want to show you some of Dr. Chen's research." As she shared the articles on her tablet, Valencia realized she was sitting very close to Donovan, their arms lightly touching. It was strange how, in just a week, she had become accustomed to his physical presence, to the rhythm of his breathing, to the heat of his skin. "This study on neural regeneration is particularly interesting," she continued, trying to ignore the sudden awareness of their proximity. "Dr. Chen has achieved promising results by combining cell therapy with electrical stimulation." "Valencia," Donovan interrupted softly, "why did you choose physical therapy?" The question took her by surprise. It was the first time he had shown interest in his personal story. "My grandmother," she replied after a moment. "She suffered a stroke when I was 12. The healthcare system, well, you know what it's like for uninsured immigrants. I learned some basic rehabilitation exercises to help her at home." "And it worked?" "She walked again after 6 months," Valencia smiled at the memory. "That's when I realized I wanted to do this forever, helping people regain not just their movement, but their independence, their dignity." Donovan watched her with an intensity that made her cheeks flush. "You never give up, do you?" "Not when I believe in something," she replied, holding his gaze. "Or someone." The plane crossed a turbulence zone, causing Valencia to instinctively grab Donovan's arm. Even after the turbulence passed, she took a second longer than necessary to let go of his arm. "Sorry," she murmured. "No need to apologize," he replied, his voice huskier than usual. "You're my wife, remember?" The comment hovered between them, loaded with unspoken meanings. Valencia turned his attention to the tablet, but his thoughts were far from scientific articles. In just 1 week, the lines between reality and acting, between professional and personal, were already beginning to blur. As the plane headed west, Valencia wondered if he had underestimated the power of his own hoax, because there, miles above, sitting next to the man who had become her contractual husband, she was beginning to feel something that no legal agreement could predict or control. Stanford Medical Center stood imposingly against the California sky, its glass walls reflecting the morning sun. Valencia pushed Donovan's chair through the halls of the neurology department, noticing how his fingers tightened on the arms of the chair with each step closer to Dr. Chen's office. "Your vitals are higher than normal," she commented casually, stopping next to a window that offered a view of the college campus. "I'm perfectly fine," Donovan replied automatically. but Valencia noticed the slight tremor in his voice. "You know," she leaned in, whispering close to his ear, "for someone who runs a corporate empire, you're terrible at hiding your nerves." Before Donovan could retort, the office door opened, revealing Dr. Lauren Chen, a middle-aged Asian woman with a penetrating gaze behind modern-rimmed glasses. "Mr. and Mrs. Sterling," she greeted, gesturing for them to enter. "I must say, I was intrigued by your case when Dr. Ramirez got in touch." The office was different from what Valencia expected, more of a research laboratory than a traditional medical room. Screens displayed MRI images and complex graphs of neural activity. "As you can see," Dr. Chen began, indicating one of the screens, "we are making significant advances in understanding neural regeneration after spinal cord injuries." Over the next hour, the doctor detailed her experimental program, a combination of cell therapy, electrical stimulation, and a new intensive rehabilitation protocol. Valencia watched Donovan closely, noting how his professional interest seemed to gradually overcome his initial skepticism. "And what are the chances of success?" he asked finally, his voice controlled. "Honestly, I can't guarantee anything," Dr. Chen replied, "but of the 12 patients in our pilot study, 8 showed significant recovery of sensation and partial movement." Valencia felt Donovan tense beside him. Instinctively, she placed her hand on his, a gesture that should have been just part of their facade as a couple, but one that carried genuine comfort. "The program requires complete dedication," Dr. Chen continued. "Initial 3 months here at Stanford, with daily rehabilitation sessions. It won't be easy." "Impossible," Donovan responded immediately. "I have a company to run." "Which can be managed remotely," Valencia interjected. "Marcus can coordinate the day-to-day operations, and you have a competent team." "Valencia?" "No," she interrupted, turning her chair to face him. "You're not going to use the company as an excuse, not when there's a real chance of progress." The silence that followed was filled with tension. Dr. Chen watched the interaction with professional interest, but Valencia barely noticed her presence. His eyes were fixed on Donovan, daring him to argue. 3 months, he finally relented, his voice low. "Excellent," Dr. Chen smiled. "We can start next week. And Mrs. Sterling, I assume you will be actively participating in the rehabilitation process?" "Absolutely," Valencia replied, still holding Donovan's hand. "That's why I'm here." After finalizing the administrative details, Valencia and Donovan left the hospital in silence. The driver was waiting to take them to the hotel, but Valencia suggested a detour through the park near the campus. "You're too quiet," she commented as she pushed her chair down a tree-lined path. "I'm processing it," he replied, his eyes fixed on the horizon. 3 months is a long time. "Enough time to change your life." Valencia stopped the chair next to a bench and sat down facing him. "What's the real problem, Donovan?" He hesitated, and Valencia saw something rare in his eyes, pure vulnerability, unmasked. "What if I fail? What if after all this effort, all these expectations, nothing changes?" "Then we'll keep trying," she replied simply. "But you won't fail. You know why? Why are you too stubborn to allow it? Because you're stronger than you think." Valencia leaned forward, her eyes level with his. "And because you are no longer alone on this journey." The moment was interrupted by Donovan's cell phone ringing, yet another corporate emergency demanding his attention. As he resolved the situation, Valencia watched students pass by, their lives moving forward without hesitation. "We're going to need an apartment," Donovan commented after hanging up. "Something close to the hospital, wheelchair accessible." "I already took care of that," Valencia smiled. "I rented an apartment in the medical complex, fully equipped. It even has a physiotherapy room." "You really thought of everything, didn't you?" "It's my job," she shrugged, but they both knew it was more than that. On the way back to the hotel, Valencia realized that something had changed between them. The agreement of convenience, the facade of marriage, everything seemed less important in light of the challenge they would face together in the coming months. As he watched Donovan fall asleep during the drive, emotionally and physically exhausted, Valencia felt a tightness in his chest, Somewhere between the signed contract and that afternoon at Stanford, their professional commitment had turned into something deeper, something neither of them had anticipated or been prepared to admit. The rented Stanford apartment was spacious and modern, but to Valencia, watching Donovan familiarize himself with his new surroundings, it felt strangely intimate. After 2 weeks living in his Manhattan penthouse, where everyone had their own space, they now shared a smaller, closer space. "The master bedroom is already adapted with all the necessary grab bars," she explained, following him down the hallway, "and I turned the office into a full physical therapy room." Donovan stopped his chair at the entrance to the room, his eyes scanning the changes. "You thought of everything," he commented, his voice carrying a note of admiration that made Valencia blush slightly. "It's my job," she responded automatically, but the phrase sounded more and more like an empty excuse. The first day of the experimental treatment started early. Valencia woke up at 5 in the morning to prepare everything they would need, only to find Donovan already awake at his laptop, conducting a video conference with the New York office. "Quarterly reports need to be reviewed before Thursday," he instructed Marcus through the screen. "And schedule a call with Chinese investors to—" "No," Valencia interrupted, unceremoniously closing the laptop. "No work before breakfast. You need to be focused for the treatment today." Donovan stared at her with a mixture of irritation and surprise. "You just got off a call with my CFO. And you're about to start an experimental treatment that could change your life," she snapped, pushing a plate of fruit toward him. "Priorities, Mr. Sterling." For a moment, it looked like he was going to protest, but then his shoulders relaxed slightly. "You're impossible, you know that." "Just determined," she smiled, sitting across from him with her own cup of coffee. "As your wife and physical therapist, it is my duty to ensure you are in the best condition possible." The comment hovered between them, loaded with unintended meanings. It was increasingly difficult to determine where the professional role ended and the personal role began. In Dr. Chen's laboratory, the reality of the experimental treatment proved more intense than they expected. The first session consisted of a series of sensitivity tests and a detailed mapping of Donovan's neural activity. "Electrical stimulation can be uncomfortable," Dr. Chen warned as she connected the electrodes. "If the pain becomes too severe, let me know immediately." Valencia remained at Donovan's side throughout the procedure, closely observing his vital signs and facial expressions. When he instinctively reached for her hand, during a particularly intense moment of stimulation, she offered it without hesitation. "I'm detecting neural response in the L4 and L5 endings," Dr. Chen commented, adjusting the parameters. "Mr. Sterling, are you feeling anything?" "Kind of a tingling sensation," Donovan replied, his voice tense. "On the right thigh." Valencia felt his heart speed up. It was the first time since the accident that Donovan reported any sensation below the level of the injury. "That's excellent, Doctor." Chen smiled, taking notes. "It means there are still intact neural pathways that we can stimulate." After 2 hours of testing, Donovan was exhausted, but Valencia could see a spark of hope in his eyes that wasn't there before. "How are you feeling?" she asked, as she helped him transfer back to the chair. "Tired," he admitted. "But different. It's like my body is waking up from a long sleep." Back at the apartment, Valencia insisted that Donovan rest before his afternoon physical therapy session. To her surprise, he didn't protest. "You don't have to stay," he said, as she helped him settle into bed. "I'm sure you have other things to do." "Actually, I don't," she replied, adjusting the pillows. "My only responsibility here is you." Their eyes met, and for a moment, the air between them seemed to carry a different electricity than the electrodes in the laboratory. "Valencia," Donovan began, his voice softer than usual. "Why did you actually accept this deal?" The question caught her off guard. "You know why. The clinic needed—" "The clinic has already received the money," he interrupted. "But you're here, dedicating every minute of your day to this treatment, as if—" He paused, searching for the right words. "Like I care," she added softly. "Try." Valencia sat on the edge of the bed, carefully considering her response. Maybe because I care. Not just as a physical therapist or as his fake wife, but as someone who sees beyond the wheelchair and the corporate contracts. The silence that followed his confession was filled with the soft sound of their breathing and the distant sound of Stanford traffic. "You should rest," Valencia finally said, standing up. "We have another session in a few hours." When she reached the door, Donovan's voice stopped her. "Valence? Try? I care too." Those 3 simple words echoed in her mind for the rest of the day, as she prepared equipment for the afternoon session and reviewed Dr. Chen's reports. The agreement they had made was beginning to turn into something more complex and frightening than any legal contract could have predicted. The first week of treatment at Stanford established a routine that tested both Donovan and Valencia's physical and emotional limits. Mornings began with intensive electrical stimulation sessions in Dr. Chen's laboratory, followed by rehabilitation exercises in the afternoon in the apartment's adapted room. "Focus on the sensation," Valencia instructed, his hands guiding the passive movements in Donovan's right leg. "Even the slightest tingling is a sign that the neural pathways are responding." Donovan lay on the specialized stretcher, beads of sweat on his forehead, showing the mental effort of trying to establish connection with long, silent muscles. "I think I felt something," he murmured, his voice tight with concentration, "like a very slight bump to the knee." Valencia contained the excitement in her voice, maintaining professionalism. "That's excellent. Let's try one more set." As she worked, she couldn't help but notice how their relationship had changed since they arrived at Stanford. The forced proximity of the smaller apartment, combined with the emotional intensity of the treatment, had created an intimacy that neither of them expected. "You're very quiet today," Donovan observed, his eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. "Just focused," she replied, adjusting the position of her hands. "Dr. Chen wants to see measurable progression by the end of the week." "Valence." The way he said her name made her pause. "Look at me." When their eyes met, there was a vulnerability in his blue-gray eyes that she rarely saw. "I need to ask you something," he continued. "Something that's been bothering me since we started this." Valencia's heart raced, but she kept her hands steady, continuing the exercises. "What is it?" "If I never walk again, if all this treatment doesn't work, will you regret it, getting involved in all this?" The question caught her off guard. Valencia stopped the exercises, sitting on the edge of the stretcher. "Why are you asking this now?" "Because," Donovan hesitated, a rare thing for him, "because I'm starting to care too much about what you think, how you feel, and I don't want you to be stuck in a hopeless situation." Valencia felt something break inside her, the last professional barrier she was still trying to maintain. "Donovan Sterling, for a brilliant businessman, you can be incredibly obtuse at times." "What do you mean?" "I want to say that I've spent the last 10 years helping people regain movement and independence. Some make it, some don't. But their value has never been tied to the end result." She took his hand, intertwining her fingers with his. "And you're not just another patient to me. Not anymore." The silence that followed was filled with unspoken emotion. Donovan squeezed her hand, and Valencia felt the slight tremor that ran through her body. "I shouldn't be feeling this," he finally said, his voice low. "It wasn't part of the deal." "None of that was part of the deal," Valencia replied softly. "But here we are." The moment was interrupted by Valencia's cell phone ringing, a reminder for the next session in the laboratory. The reality of their situation came back full force. They were technically married, but by contract. They were therapist and patient, but something else was growing between them. "We need to go," she said, reluctant to let go of his hand. "Dr. Chen wants to try a new protocol today." As he helped Donovan transfer to the chair, Valencia felt the weight of his gaze. There was a new tension in the air, an electricity that had nothing to do with the treatment electrodes. In the lab, Dr. Chen noticed the change in the dynamic between them, even though they tried to maintain a professional facade. Positive emotional connection can significantly benefit the recovery process, she commented casually as she adjusted the equipment. Like this? Donovan asked, his eyes meeting Valencia's briefly. The brain responds better to treatment when there is a strong emotional support system, the doctor explained. Confidence, security, motivation, all of these factors influence neuroplasticity. Valencia felt her cheeks heat up, but she kept her focus on the monitor displaying Donovan's neural activity. The response spikes felt stronger today, as if his body was gradually awakening from a long sleep. Let's try something new, Dr. Chen announced. Valencia, you will guide the movements as we apply stimulation. Donovan, I want you to focus not just on the physical sensation, but on the emotional connection to the movement. What followed was a delicate dance of touch, technology, and trust. Valencia's hands guided with professional precision, but there was an extra gentleness in his touch that didn't go unnoticed by anyone present. At the end of the session, when Dr. Chen showed the comparative results, there was a significant improvement in the neural response patterns. Whatever you guys are doing, she smiled, it's working. On the way back to the apartment, a comfortable silence filled the car. Valencia drove, occasionally stealing glances at Donovan, who seemed lost in thought. What are you thinking about? She finally asked. How ironic life is, he replied, a small smile playing on his lips. I planned this wedding as a business transaction, and now... And now? And now I'm starting to realize that maybe it's not just a contract anymore. The second week of treatment at Stanford brought an unexpected discovery during one of the morning sessions. Valencia was adjusting the electrodes on Donovan's right leg when he suddenly grabbed his arm. I felt it, he said, his voice shaking with emotion, not just tingling. I felt your fingers, real pressure. Dr. Chen immediately began a series of sensation tests, confirming that there was partial recovery of sensation in specific areas of the right thigh. Valencia maintained his professional demeanor during the tests, but his heart was beating wildly in his chest. This is a significant advance, Dr. Chen explained, taking detailed notes. We need to intensify the treatment protocol immediately. Back at the apartment, the energy between Valencia and Donovan was palpable. She watched him during lunch, noticing how his eyes occasionally dropped to his right leg, as if he still couldn't believe the sensation he had experienced. You're too quiet, she commented, sitting next to you at the kitchen table. I'm trying to process it, he replied, his fingers drumming nervously on the table. After the accident, the doctors said that any recovery of sensation would be practically impossible. Valencia covered his hand with hers, stopping the nervous movement. Those doctors didn't have access to this experimental treatment, and they certainly didn't have you as a patient. You mean they didn't have you as a physical therapist? Donovan corrected, turning his hand to intertwine his fingers with hers. The gesture, so simple and intimate, made Valencia's heart skip a beat. It was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain the professional barriers she had so carefully constructed. I need to show you something, she said, standing up abruptly. He went to his workbook and came back with a digital file on his tablet. These are Dr. Chen's latest studies on neural regeneration in injuries similar to yours. Donovan examined the data with his usual businessman's analytical eye. These results are impressive. They're more than impressive. Valencia leaned over his shoulder, pointing to specific graphics. They show that with the right combination of electrical stimulation and intensive therapy, neural pathways can establish new pathways. Valencia's soft scent enveloped Donovan, momentarily distracting him from the data. How can you keep so much hope? Because I've seen miracles happen, she replied simply. At the community clinic, I had patients who the doctors had failed, but who through persistence and dedication made extraordinary progress. It's different, Donovan argued. Those patients probably didn't have such severe injuries. Valencia swiveled her chair so he was facing her directly. Stop comparing yourself to other cases. Your journey is unique, and what happened today proves that your body is responding to treatment. Their faces were close, very close. Valencia could see the slight variations of grey in Donovan's eyes, the slight quiver in his lower lip. "How do you do that?" he asked softly. "Do what?" "It makes me want to believe. In recovery, in possibilities, in us." The word "we" hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning. Valencia felt her heart accelerate, aware that they were crossing a line that could not be redrawn. "Donovan," she began, but was interrupted by the sound of the apartment's intercom. It was Marcus, the personal assistant, with a stack of documents that needed immediate attention. The intimate moment was broken, but something had changed irrevocably between them. During the afternoon physical therapy session, Valencia noticed a new determination in Donovan. He focused intensely on each exercise, his usual frustration replaced by an almost meditative focus. "You look different today," she commented as she guided his movements. "Maybe because for the first time in a long time I can actually feel what you're doing," he replied, a small smile playing on his lips. Valencia adjusted the position of his hands, applying pressure to specific points. "Here?" "Yes," he breathed, closing his eyes. "It's like my body is waking up from a long sleep." That day's progress altered not only the treatment protocol, but also the dynamics between them. That evening, as Valencia updated reports for Dr. Chen, she found Donovan on the apartment's balcony, looking out over the brightly lit Stanford campus. "Can't sleep?" she asked, sitting in the chair next to him. "I'm scared to sleep," he admitted, scared of waking up and finding out it was all a dream. Valencia reached out, gently touching her right leg. "Can you feel it?" "Yes," he replied, covering her hand with his own. "I can feel you." The words carried a double meaning that neither of them could ignore. The contract that had united them now seemed like a distant detail compared to the intimacy that was growing between them. The third week of treatment at Stanford brought an unexpected change in routine when Marcus arrived with urgent news from New York. One of Sterling Enterprises' major investors was threatening to withdraw his support, concerned about Donovan's prolonged absence. "They want a face-to-face meeting," Marcus explained, showing emails on his tablet. "The council is uneasy about rumors about your condition." Valencia watched the tension settle in Donovan's shoulders as he read the documents. They were in the midst of making significant progress with the treatment. In addition to tenderness in the right leg, small involuntary movements had been recorded during the last few sessions. "We can't stop the treatment now," she said, her voice firm. "The next few days are crucial for neural consolidation." Donovan ran a hand over his face, a gesture she had learned to recognize as a sign of stress. "How long do we need?" "At least 2 more weeks to complete this phase of the protocol," Valencia replied, consulting his notes. "Dr. Chen is optimistic about the recent results." "Investors are not going to wait 2 weeks," Marcus interjected. "They want guarantees now." Valencia felt an idea form in his mind. What if we take the mountain to Muhammad? Both men looked at her curiously. "Explain," Donovan asked, his eyes fixed on her with that intensity that made her heart race. "We can organize a video conference right here in the lab," she suggested. "Show them in real time the progress you're making. Let them see for themselves that this isn't just an experimental treatment, it's a real transformation." A small smile began to form on Donovan's lips. "Do you want to use my recovery as a business strategy?" "I'm suggesting we turn your supposed weaknesses into strengths," Valencia replied, leaning across the table. "Show them that you're not hiding your condition. You're actively working to overcome it." Marcus began typing furiously on his tablet. "I can arrange a secure transmission from the lab to the boardroom in New York. With the right technology, they will be able to see all the monitors and data in real time." "We need to talk to Dr. Chen first," Valencia reminded. "This is an experimental treatment, and we need to ensure that the confidentiality of the protocols is maintained." Donovan watched Valencia with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. There was admiration there, but also something deeper, more personal. "You keep surprising me," he said softly, as Marcus left to make the necessary arrangements. "Like this." Most people would only see the obstacles, the nervous investor, the interrupted treatment. but you immediately looked for a solution that benefits all sides. Valencia sat on the edge of the table next to him. I learned this at the community clinic. When you have limited resources, you have to be creative with solutions. Donovan's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining naturally. You know what surprises me most? How you can be completely professional and deeply personal at the same time. The comment made Valencia's heart skip a beat. It was true. In recent weeks, the lines between therapist and wife, between professional and personal, had become increasingly blurred. Sometimes I wonder, she admitted, her voice low, if I'm crossing lines that should remain intact. What lines? Between caring for you as your physical therapist and... She hesitated, searching for the right words. And caring for you as something more. The silence that followed was filled with unresolved tension. Donovan squeezed her hand lightly, pulling her closer. Valencia, he began, but they were interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Chen. The doctor brought with her the latest test results, which showed a consistent progression in neural activity. After a long discussion, she agreed to the video conference plan, with some specific conditions about what aspects of the treatment could be revealed. But I need to warn you, she said, looking seriously at Donovan, that any additional stress could negatively impact the progress we've made. I'll take care of it, Valencia assured, his professional mode automatically turning on. We will maintain regular sessions in the morning and do the video conference in the afternoon, when he is more rested. As they discussed the technical details with Marcus, who had returned with an IT team, Valencia noticed how Donovan was watching her. There was a new kind of respect in his gaze, mixed with something that seemed dangerously close to affection. Later, during her afternoon physical therapy session, that look continued to haunt her. His hands worked with professional precision on Donovan's muscles, but each touch seemed charged with a deeper meaning. You're tense, he observed, feeling the change in his touch. Just worried about tomorrow, she lied, knowing her tension had more to do with the growing intimacy between them than the planned video conference. Valencia, Donovan's voice was soft but insistent. Look at me. When their eyes met, all professional pretensions seemed to melt. Here was a man who had entered her life through a cold contract, but who now occupied a space in her heart that no legal agreement could define. We need to talk about this, he said, verbalizing what they had both been avoiding. Yes, she agreed, we do, but not today. Today we need to focus on preparing you for tomorrow. Donovan nodded, respecting his need to remain professionally focused, but his eyes promised that the conversation would not be postponed indefinitely. Night fell over Stanford, enveloping the apartment in soft shadows. Valencia stayed up late, reviewing data and preparing presentations for the video conference, trying not to think about the warmth she felt every time Donovan looked at her in that special way, or how much her heart raced when their hands touched, even in the most casual gestures. The contract that had brought them together was turning into something far more complex and frightening than either of them could have predicted. And tomorrow, before the watchful eyes of the Sterling Enterprises board, they would need to navigate not only the complexities of medical treatment, but also the growing feelings that no legal document could contain. The video conference with the Sterling Enterprises board was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon, but since dawn, Dr. Chen's lab was buzzing with activity. Technicians adjusted cameras and monitors as Valencia oversaw every detail of Donovan's morning treatment session, determined to ensure he was in the best condition possible for the performance. Your stress levels are high, she commented, noting the tension in her muscles as she performed the preparatory exercises. I need you to relax, or the results won't be as evident as they could be. How can I relax when the future of my company depends on this presentation? Donovan responded, but there was a teasing tone in his voice that made Valencia smile. The future of your company depends on you being honest with your investors, she corrected, her fingers working precisely on the tension points, and show them that you're making real progress. Dr. Chen entered the lab, carrying a folder of results. The latest neural conduction tests are here, she announced, and they're even more promising than we expected. Valencia looked over the charts, her heart racing at the implications. Neural activity in the lower back has increased by 40% since the start of treatment. This is extraordinary. That's what we intend to show the council, Donovan commented, his eyes fixed on Valencia. Along with a practical demonstration. The suggestion made Valencia pause his movements. Are you sure? We haven't tried anything like that in public yet. It's not public, he argued. These are people who need to understand that I'm not just hiding out at Stanford. I'm fighting to get back. The determination in his voice touched something deep in Valencia. In recent weeks, she had witnessed not only Donovan's gradual physical recovery, but also a transformation in his attitude. The man who initially viewed treatment as just another business transaction now demonstrated a genuine passion for his own recovery. The morning passed in a blur of preparations. Marcus coordinated the technical team, while Valencia and Dr. Chen refined their presentation. Donovan alternated between emergency calls with executives and short exercise sessions to keep his muscles responsive. At 1:45 p.m., the laboratory was transformed. High-definition screens showed Donovan's vital signs and neural response data in real time. Strategically placed cameras would allow the board to see every aspect of the treatment. 5 minutes, Marcus announced, nervously adjusting his tie. Valencia approached Donovan, who was positioned on the special treatment table. Remember, she whispered, leaning in so only he could hear, no matter what happens in the next few minutes, your progress is real. No one can take that away from you. He captured her hand, intertwining their fingers. I'm stronger when you're around, he admitted softly. Bravest. The intimate moment was interrupted by the sound of the screens turning on. One by one, the faces of the council members appeared, their expressions varying between skepticism and concern. Ladies and gentlemen, Donovan began, his voice firm and professional, I thank you for your virtual presence today. I would like to introduce Dr. Lauren Chen, a leader in neural regeneration research, and of course you already know my wife, Dr. Valencia Sterling. The use of her married name took Valencia by surprise. It was the first time he had introduced her that way, but there was no time to process the emotions this aroused as the performance began. Over the next hour, they walked the council through Donovan's progress. Dr. Chen explained the science behind the treatment, while Valencia demonstrated practical techniques, each touch eliciting visible responses on the monitors. What you're seeing now, Valencia explained, applying pressure to specific points on Donovan's right leg, is real neural activity in areas that were completely numb 3 weeks ago. As if to emphasize his point, the main monitor recorded a spike in electrical activity. Several council members leaned back in their chairs, clearly impressed. Mr. Sterling, one of the more skeptical councillors interjected, while these results are interesting, how much longer will this treatment require your presence at Stanford? As long as necessary, Donovan replied without hesitation. My team in New York is more than capable of managing day-to-day operations, as last quarter's numbers demonstrate. What about your long-term condition? It was Valencia who responded, her voice carrying an authority that surprised even herself. Mr. Sterling's condition is not a limitation. It is an opportunity for innovation. Every advancement we make here not only benefits his personal recovery, but also positions Sterling Enterprises at the forefront of medical research. She noticed the small smile of pride on Donovan's face as she continued, Imagine the impact when we announce that the CEO not only overcame his injury, but also contributed to revolutionary advances in the treatment of spinal cord injuries. A murmur of approval ran through the council. Even the most skeptical members seemed to reconsider their positions. The presentation ended with a final demonstration. Using a combination of electrical stimulation and techniques developed over the past few weeks, Valencia guided Donovan through a movement that resulted in a visible flexion of his right knee. When the screens finally went dark, the silence in the lab was broken by a collective sigh of relief. Dr. Chen was smiling as she reviewed the data collected during the session, and Marcus was already on the phone receiving positive feedback from board members. You were amazing, Donovan whispered to Valencia when they were finally alone in a corner of the lab. Like always. We were amazing, she corrected, still holding his hand. As a team. The look they shared carried the weight of everything that had yet to be said between them. The growing affection that went far beyond any contract, the trust that transcended the therapist-patient relationship, the uncertain future that somehow seemed less scary when faced together. The morning after the video conference, Valencia found Donovan already awake in the apartment's makeshift office, analyzing data on his tablet. The success of the board presentation had brought new energy to him, but also a heightened determination that worried her slightly. "You should be resting," she said, placing a cup of coffee next to her. "We had an intense session yesterday." "I was reviewing Dr. Chen's reports," he replied, showing graphs on his tablet. "The neural progression of the last few days is remarkable." Valencia leaned over his shoulder to examine the data, aware of their physical proximity. The soft scent of his aftershave distracted her momentarily. "It's impressive," she agreed, forcing herself to focus on the numbers. "But we need to maintain a sustainable pace. Neural recovery is not a race." "Says the woman who spent all night planning to intensify my exercise program," Donovan smiled, turning his chair to face her. "I found your notes in the physical therapy room." Valencia blushed slightly, caught in her own contradiction. "It's different. As your therapist, I need to plan each progression carefully. And as my wife." Donovan's words hung between them, loaded with meaning. "Donovan." "We can't keep avoiding this conversation, Valencia," he said softly. "Not after yesterday." She knew exactly what he was referring to, the moment on the video conference when he introduced her as Dr. Valencia Sterling, the way their hands instinctively met during the demonstration, the look they shared after the cameras turned off. "It's complicated," she finally replied, sitting in the chair next to him. "I'm your physical therapist. There are ethical limits, which we already crossed weeks ago," he added. "You know as well as I do that this is no longer just a professional arrangement." Valencia closed her eyes for a moment, trying to organize her thoughts. "I'm scared," she admitted, "afraid that my personal feelings will compromise your treatment." "Or maybe it's just the opposite," Donovan argued, taking her hand. "Perhaps it is this connection that is making the treatment so effective." As if to prove his point, he moved his right leg slightly, a small but controlled movement that would have been impossible 3 weeks ago. "Did you see that?" He smiled. "I managed to do it consciously this time. And do you know when I realized I could? Yesterday during the video conference, when you were by my side, giving me strength." Valencia felt tears forming in her eyes. "That's amazing," she whispered, instinctively moving to examine her leg. "The neural connection is really strengthening." "Valencia," Donovan called softly, lifting her chin with a finger so she would look at him. "It's not just the neural connection that is strengthening." The moment was interrupted by Marcus's arrival with the day's schedule. Valencia retreated, resuming his professional stance, but something had changed irrevocably between them. During her morning lab session, Dr. Chen noticed the new dynamic. "The synchronization between you is even better today," she commented as she adjusted the electrodes. "Neural response patterns are more consistent when Valencia guides movements." "It's because she knows every inch of my body," Donovan replied, his deliberately provocative tone making Valencia blush. "Professionally speaking," she added quickly, shooting him a warning look. But Dr. Chen just smiled knowingly. "Emotional connection is a significant factor in neurological recovery. Some of the best results I have ever documented have come from patients with strong emotional support." In the afternoon, during a break between sessions, Valencia found Donovan on his apartment balcony, watching the sun set over the Stanford campus. Without saying a word, she sat down next to him. "Remember the day we signed the contract?" he asked after a moment. "How could I forget? You were the arrogant billionaire who viewed our marriage as a business transaction. And you were the stubborn physical therapist who only cared about saving your clinic," he smiled. "Look where we are now." Valencia turned to face him. "Where exactly are we, Donovan?" "In a place no contract could predict," he replied, his voice soft. "A place where every physical progress I make is intertwined with how I feel about you." "And what do you feel?" In response, Donovan moved his chair closer, his hand finding hers with a familiarity that went beyond the therapeutic touches they had shared over the past few weeks. "I feel like I've found something much more valuable than a facade to appease investors," he said. "I found someone who sees me beyond the wheelchair, beyond the corporate empire, someone who makes me want to be stronger, not just physically, but in every way." Valencia felt her heart quicken at his words. It was true. Somewhere between the physical therapy sessions and the nights spent planning treatments, she had fallen in love not with the billionaire or the patient, but with the man Donovan really was. The morning started differently in the Stanford apartment. Valencia woke up to the soft sound of classical music coming from the physical therapy room. When he investigated, he found Donovan already positioned on the special stretcher, performing alone some of the basic exercises she had taught him. "Woke up early," she commented, noting with professional pride, and something more, the determination on his face. "I couldn't sleep," he replied, concentrating on keeping the controlled movement of his right leg. "After our conversation yesterday." Valencia felt her heart quicken at the memory. She approached the gurney, automatically assuming her professional position beside him. "Your movements are more coordinated today." "I have a good teacher," Donovan smiled, but then his expression turned serious. "Valencia, about yesterday." "Dr. Sterling?" Marcus's voice interrupted the moment. "Urgent connection from New York." Valencia retreated, resuming his professional stance. "I'll get the equipment ready for our session with Dr. Chen while you sort this out." In the lab, Dr. Chen immediately noticed the tension between them. "The emotional connection is different today," she commented as she adjusted the electrodes. "More intense." "It's just the stress of the treatment," Valencia tried to explain, but her voice betrayed her. "Valencia," the doctor paused her work. "May I speak not as your supervisor, but as someone who has seen many similar cases?" "Similar?" "Couples who started out as a professional relationship and discovered something deeper during the recovery process." Valencia felt her cheeks flush. "It is complicated." "Life usually is," Dr. Chen smiled. "But sometimes complications lead us exactly where we need to be." That morning's session brought another significant advance. During a particularly intense exercise, Donovan was able to not only move his right knee, but also maintain control of the movement for several seconds. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Chen exclaimed, quickly documenting the data. "Neural recovery is progressing much faster than expected." Valencia watched the monitors with tears in her eyes, torn between professional pride and personal emotion. When Donovan reached for her hand, she offered it without hesitation. "It was you," he whispered, just for her to hear. "Your presence gives me strength." Back at the apartment, as Valencia prepared the lunch they would share, Donovan surprised her by maneuvering her chair into the kitchen without assistance. "We need to talk," he said, his voice determined. "No interruptions this time." Valencia stopped what he was doing, sitting at the kitchen table. "You're right. We need it." "Yesterday, you said you were afraid your personal feelings would compromise my treatment," Donovan began. "But what if it's exactly the opposite? What if it's precisely this connection that's making everything possible? The science behind the treatment." "Science explains procedures," he interrupted gently. "But it doesn't explain why my responses are always stronger when you're near. It doesn't explain why I can make movements that seemed impossible when I feel your touch." Valencia felt tears forming in her eyes. "Donovan, you don't understand. If this goes wrong, if we go wrong, then we will have tried," he added, moving his chair closer to her. "Valencia, when we signed that contract, I was looking for a commercial solution, a facade to appease investors. Instead, I found something much more valuable." "What?" "I found someone who sees me completely, not as the CEO of Sterling Enterprises, not as the man in the wheelchair, but as I truly am, with all my strengths and weaknesses." Valencia could no longer hold back her tears. "I also found something I didn't expect," she admitted softly. "I found someone who makes me want to be more than just a competent professional. Someone who makes me dream of possibilities that go beyond any contract." Donovan reached out, gently wiping a tear from her face. So maybe it's time to tear up that contract and write our own story. And your treatment? It will continue to be a priority, he assured. But not just because I need to recover moves. Now I want to recover because I want to really dance with you, not just for the investors' cameras. The comment drew an emotional laugh from Valencia. You're making very big promises, Mr. Sterling. And I intend to fulfill every one of them, Mrs. Sterling, he replied, his voice thick with emotion. With your help, of course. At that moment, looking into each other's eyes in the small kitchen of their Stanford apartment, they both understood that they had crossed a line from which there was no return. The contract that had brought them together was turning into something much deeper and truer. A partnership based not on legal agreements, but on trust, respect, and a love that had grown silently between physical therapy sessions and shared moments. Dawn at Stanford brought with it a different energy to Dr. Chen's lab. After 4 weeks of intensive treatment, the results had exceeded all initial expectations. Valencia was organizing the latest reports when Donovan arrived for his morning session, his smile lighting up the entire room. I managed to transfer myself from the bed to the chair today, he announced, satisfaction evident in his voice. No help from Marcus. Valencia felt her heart expand with pride and affection. Show me, she asked, instinctively assuming her professional stance, even as her eyes betrayed a much more personal emotion. Donovan maneuvered his chair to the treatment table and, with calculated movements that demonstrated weeks of practice, performed the transfer. The process wasn't perfect. There was a moment of hesitation, a slight tremor in the arms, but it was undoubtedly significant progress. Impressive, Dr. Chen's voice sounded from the laboratory door, especially considering where we started a month ago. The doctor approached with a folder of results that made Valencia hold her breath. It was the moment they had been waiting for, the complete assessment of the first month of treatment and recommendations for next steps. The data is extraordinary, Dr. Chen began, spreading graphs and images across the table. Neural regeneration has progressed 60% beyond our initial projections, and what's most interesting is the pattern of recovery. Like this? Donovan asked, his fingers unconsciously searching for Valencia's hand. Spikes of neural activity are consistently stronger during Valencia sessions, the doctor explained, pointing to a series of graphs. It's as if your nervous system responds specifically to the connection between you. Valencia felt her cheeks flush, but remained professionally focused. And is this common in your studies? Not at this intensity, Dr. Chen smiled knowingly. Which brings me to the next phase of treatment. The doctor presented a new protocol that combined electrical stimulation with more intense mobility exercises. But, she added, there is one condition. Which? Donovan and Valencia asked simultaneously. You need to resolve this unresolved tension between you, Dr. Chen stated directly. As a doctor, I can say it's positively affecting the treatment, but as someone who works with you on a daily basis, it's becoming distracting. The silence that followed was filled with suppressed emotion. Valencia focused on organizing the scattered papers, trying to ignore the heat rising up her neck. It's not that simple, she finally said. There are ethical considerations, which are already completely outdated, Dr. Chen interrupted gently. Valencia, you're not just his physical therapist. You're his partner on this journey. And Donovan, you stopped being just a patient the moment you started looking at her like that. What way? He asked, a small smile playing on his lips. As if she were your private son, the doctor replied simply, collecting her papers. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a meeting with the research team. Think about what I said. When they were alone in the laboratory, the silence between them had a different weight. Valencia continued his preparations for the session, but each movement seemed charged with additional meaning. She's right, you know, Donovan finally said, his voice soft, about you being my sunshine. Valencia stopped what he was doing, his hands shaking slightly. Donovan. No, let me finish, he insisted, maneuvering his chair to face her. Before the accident, I lived in a world of numbers and contracts. Afterwards, I was plunged into bitterness and self-pity. But you brought light back into my life. I was just doing my job, she protested weakly. No, he smiled, taking your hand. Your job was to be my physical therapist and cover wife. Instead, you became my strength, my inspiration, my reason for wanting to improve, not just physically, but as a person. Valencia felt tears forming in her eyes. I'm so scared, she admitted, afraid that this will complicate your recovery, afraid that we are confusing gratitude with something more. Then let me prove it's not confusion, Donovan said, and with a movement that surprised them both, he used the newly regained strength in his legs to propel himself slightly forward, bringing their faces closer. The kiss that followed was soft, hesitant, filled with months of pent-up emotion. When they separated, Valencia saw in Donovan's eyes the entire future they had avoided discussing. I think we just complicated Dr. Chen's report even more, she whispered, a smile trembling on her lips. On the contrary, he replied, stroking her face, I think we just simplified everything. The California sun illuminated the Stanford campus in golden light as Valencia organized the final results of Donovan's treatment on his tablet. 5 weeks had passed since they arrived, and the transformation went far beyond the impressive medical data that filled the screens. Overthinking again? Donovan's voice surprised her. He had approached silently in his chair, a skill he had perfected over the past few weeks. Just reviewing your progress before the final presentation to the council, she replied, but her smile betrayed the personal nature of her thoughts. The final video conference with the Sterling Enterprises board was scheduled for that afternoon. It would be time to present not only the medical results of the experimental treatment, but also discuss the next steps, both professional and personal. Speaking of progress, Donovan smiled, maneuvering his chair over to the treatment table, I have a surprise for you. Valencia watched, first with curiosity and then with growing emotion, as Donovan performed the transfer to the stretcher with a fluidity he hadn't possessed 5 weeks ago. But it was what happened next that made his heart stop. Using his arms as initial support, he managed to move both legs into a sitting position, keeping them stable for several seconds. Donovan, she whispered, tears forming in her eyes, you've been practicing alone. Every morning, before you wake up, he admitted, I wanted to be sure before I showed it. Valencia moved closer, his professional fingers automatically checking muscular tension and neural response, even as his heart beat unsteadily with the intimacy of the moment. The movement patterns are incredibly coordinated, she commented, trying to maintain professional composure. The neural connection has actually strengthened beyond our initial expectations. It's not just the neural connection that has strengthened, Donovan replied softly, capturing her hand and halting her assessment. Valencia, we need to talk about what happens after today. The moment was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Chen, carrying the final test results. His smile indicated good news. The latest scans have confirmed neural regeneration has reached levels that we considered theoretically possible, but had never documented in practice, she announced, spreading images and graphs on the table. Your case will revolutionize our understanding of spinal cord injury recovery. Wow? Valencia asked, noting the specific use of the word. Yes, wow, Donovan confirmed, exchanging a meaningful look with the doctor. Sterling Enterprises is partnering with Dr. Chen's research program. We will expand access to this treatment for patients who cannot afford it. Valencia felt her legs weaken, needing to support herself on the table. Did you plan this? Actually, Dr. Chen interjected, it was your idea, Valencia. Remember when you mentioned how this treatment could benefit patients at your community clinic? Well, Donovan turned that casual comment into a concrete project. The implications were enormous. A program that combined Stanford's medical expertise with the resources of Sterling Enterprises could make spinal cord injury treatment affordable for underserved communities. But that's not all, Donovan continued, his voice carrying a note of nervousness that Valencia rarely heard. Dr. Chen, could you give us a moment? When they were alone in the lab, Donovan took a deep breath before continuing. Valencia, these 5 weeks have changed everything. Not just my physical condition, but my perspective on what really matters. Donovan, let me finish, he asked softly. When we signed that contract in New York, I was looking for a business solution to an image problem. Instead, I found something much more valuable. I found you. Valencia felt tears streaming down her cheeks as Donovan continued. I found someone who saw beyond the CEO, beyond the wheelchair. Someone who challenged me to be better, not just physically, but as a person. With a movement that demonstrated all his recent progress, Donovan adjusted his position on the gurney, sitting up straighter. The original contract was for 2 years, but I don't want to wait that long. I want to turn our facade into reality, not because we have to, but because we choose to. Are you asking me what I think you're asking? Valencia asked, her heart beating so hard she could barely hear her own thoughts. I'm asking us to rewrite our history, he smiled, taking your hand. Not as a physical therapist and patient, not as a business arrangement, but as two people who found something extraordinary when they least expected it. Valencia looked at their clasped hands, remembering the first day in her office, when everything seemed so clear and defined by contracts and professional obligations. What about the board, the investors? You can think what you want, Donovan replied with determination. My physical recovery proves that I am perfectly capable of leading the company, and our partnership with Stanford shows that we are expanding in innovative directions. But more important than all of that, you make me want to be a better person, Valencia. A person worthy of the love you have shown me these weeks. In that moment, looking into the eyes of the man who had entered her life through a cold contract and transformed into something so deeply meaningful, Valencia knew her answer. Yes, she whispered, leaning in to kiss him softly. Let's rewrite our history, together. The kiss was interrupted by the sound of applause. Dr. Chen had returned with her team for final preparations for the video conference. But this time, when they separated, there was no awkwardness or attempts to maintain professional facades. What had begun as an agreement of convenience had transformed into something much deeper and truer, a story of healing that went far beyond physical regeneration, reaching the very hearts of those involved.